By the time my son-in-law pulled into my driveway that Saturday morning with that look on his face, the one he always wore when he thought he was in control of something, all he found was a lockbox on the front door, a realtor sign in the yard with a red Sate sticker slapped across it, and a folded letter with his name on it tucked under the welcome mat. I watched from my neighbor Edith's kitchen window across the street. I watched him read the letter. I watched his face change. And I felt, for the first time in almost 2 years, like I could breathe again. But let me back up, because none of this started that Saturday morning. It started on a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray, flat Tuesday that feels like it could disappear from the calendar entirely and nobody would notice. I was sitting in my recliner in the living room, the one by the window that looks out over the backyard, reading a history book about the Pacific Theater. My daughter and her husband thought I was asleep. I had the television on low, an old habit from when my wife was alive and liked the background noise. They were in the kitchen, maybe 20 feet away, and the house was quiet enough that I heard every word. My daughter's voice first. She said, "He's not going to like it, but we don't have a choice. The market's not going to stay like this." Then, my son-in-law, "He doesn't have to like it. He just has to sign." A pause. The sound of a cabinet closing. "What if he says no? He won't. He's got nowhere else to go, and he knows it. We just have to be patient a little longer. Get through the holidays, keep him comfortable, then sit him down in January." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't want to do this on Christmas," my daughter said. Her voice was quieter, but not because she felt guilty. It was the voice of someone negotiating a schedule, not a conscience. "We're not doing it on Christmas," my son-in-law said. "We're doing it after. New Year's, maybe. Fresh start. Fresh start. Fresh start." I remember staring at the spine of my book and thinking about that phrase. Fresh start, as if selling the house I had lived in for 31 years. The house where my daughter learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where my wife and I repainted the kitchen 3 times before we got the color right, where I brought my grandchildren home from the hospital, as if all of that was just a chapter someone else could decide to close. I did not move. I did not say anything. I turned a page in my book that I did not read, and I let the television fill the silence, and I thought about what a man does when he realizes the people he trusted most have been planning around him the way you plan around furniture. My name is Leonard Marsh. I am 67 years old. For 32 years, I worked as a civil engineer for the county, bridges, drainage systems, infrastructure projects that most people drive over without thinking about. I retired at 63, not because I had to, but because my wife had gotten sick and I wanted to be home with her. She passed 14 months after I retired. Pancreatic cancer. We had 40 years together, and I would trade every bridge I ever built to have had 41. After she passed, the house felt enormous. My daughter Renee. Wait, no. In this story, let me call her what I always called her when she was small, before she became someone I didn't entirely recognize. My daughter. She and her husband had been living in an apartment in Phoenix, and when her mother died, she suggested they move in with me for a while. Help with the house. Help with the grief. That was the word she used. Help. My daughter's name is Corinne. Her husband's name is Brett. Brett had been between jobs when they moved in. He had a background in real estate investment, which means he spent a lot of time looking at things and calculating what they were worth to someone other than the person who owned them. He was not a bad man, exactly. He was the kind of man who divided the world into assets and liabilities, and had somewhere along the way decided that old people generally fell into the second category. They moved in on a Wednesday in March. By May, Brett had started mentioning property taxes. By August, he was suggesting that a house this size was a lot to maintain for one person. By October, I noticed he had started looking at the garage as if he was measuring it for something. But it was that Tuesday in November that changed everything, because, up until that moment, I had been telling myself a story about my own family. The story where Corinne's motivations were complicated but ultimately loving. The story where Brett was difficult but not dishonest. That Tuesday in November, standing in my own hallway, in my own socks, I understood that the story I had been telling myself was a courtesy I had extended to them that they had not extended to me. I slept on it. I slept on it for 3 nights, which is my way of making decisions that matter. By Friday, I was certain. By Saturday morning, I had made a phone call. The man I called was a former colleague named James Okafor, to be precise, a retired structural engineer who had pivoted into real estate law somewhere in his 50s and built a second career doing it. Jim and I had worked on a county drainage project together back in the 90s, and we had stayed in touch the way men of a certain age stay in touch. Christmas cards, the occasional lunch, a phone call when something real happened. I called him on a Saturday morning and I said, "Jim, I need your help with something, and I need you to not mention it to anyone." Jim said, "Leonard, I've been doing this for 16 years. You want to tell me what's going on?" So I told him everything. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line, and then Jim said, "All right, let's talk about your options." What followed was 2 months of the most deliberate, careful work I had done since my engineering days. I learned things I had not known. I learned, for instance, that a homeowner has every right to sell their property without notifying adult children who are living in the home as guests, which is what Brett and Corinne were, legally speaking, despite what Brett seemed to believe about the future. I learned about a process called a sale-leaseback arrangement, which would allow me to sell the house to a buyer while negotiating the right to remain in the home as a tenant for a period of time, giving me time to find my own place without being displaced the moment the deal closed. I learned that Jim knew a real estate broker named Annette, who worked with sellers in exactly these kinds of family situations, and that Annette was discreet and efficient and had seen it all. I want to be clear about something. I did not do any of this out of hatred. I am not a hateful man. I did it because I realized that my daughter and her husband had been making plans about my life as though I were a child, or worse, as though I were already gone, and that if I waited for them to sit me down in January, I would be negotiating from a position they had already staked out and furnished. I have spent 67 years learning that the difference between a man who keeps his dignity and a man who loses it is almost always a matter of timing. The holidays came. I played my part. I cooked the turkey at Thanksgiving because I always cook the turkey, and because a man who stops doing the things he loves in his own kitchen on a Tuesday in November has already surrendered something he can't get back. Brett carved, as he always did, with the authority of a man who has decided that standing at the head of the table is the same as owning the table. I watched him and felt nothing in particular. Annette and Jim were already moving. Christmas was the same. Corinne made her pies, the apple and the pecan, the ones her mother taught her. And for a moment, watching her roll out the crust on the kitchen counter, I felt the weight of everything that had gotten us to this place. She looked so much like her mother from certain angles. I had to look away. On Christmas morning, we opened gifts in the living room. Brett had given me a Kindle. Corinne had given me a cardigan in a blue I would never wear. I gave Corinne a bracelet her mother had left in a drawer and told her she should have it. She teared up a little. Brett looked at his phone. 2 weeks after Christmas, Jim called me to say we had an offer on the house. The buyers were a couple from out of state. He was being relocated for work. They needed to close quickly, and they were offering $11,000 over asking. Jim had negotiated a 90-day leaseback at a modest monthly rate, which I could afford comfortably from my pension and my savings. The paperwork was clean. The timeline was clear. I signed everything at Jim's office on a Tuesday afternoon while Corinne and Brett were both at work. I told no one. I spent those 3 months being exactly the same person I had always been in that house. I cooked. I read. I watched my programs. I went to the hardware store on Saturdays and bought things I didn't need just to walk around and think. Brett kept mentioning January, then February. One evening in February, he sat down across from me in the living room and said, in the patient voice people use with the elderly and with children, "Leonard, we should probably start talking about some planning for the future." I looked at him over my reading glasses. "I agree," I said. He seemed surprised. He nodded slowly, like I had just confirmed something he had suspected. He started talking about senior communities, about the equity in the house, about how a smaller place might be more manageable. He talked for a long time. I listened the way I used to listen to long presentations at county meetings, attentively, without interruption. taking note of what was being revealed beneath what was being said. When he finished, I said, "That sounds like a lot of change." "It is," he said, "but it's the right kind of change." "I appreciate you looking out for me," I said. I excused myself to go to bed. I lay in the dark for a while in the room I had shared with my wife for 31 years, listening to the house settle the way old houses do, and I thought about the Pacific Theater book on my nightstand, about all those men who won battles not by charging forward, but by choosing the moment carefully and knowing the terrain better than the enemy did. In March, I found my new place, a two-bedroom condominium in a quiet development about 6 miles from the house, on the third floor with a view of a small lake. It cost significantly less than my share of the home sale, and the rest I placed in a trust that Jim helped me structure. The condo had a second bedroom I was already planning to use as a study. I bought a new chair for it, not a recliner, something with more spine, and I placed it by the window, and I sat in it once before I moved in, just to see what the light was like in the afternoon. I moved my belongings out on a Thursday and Friday when Corinne and Brett were both at work. I did not take much. The furniture I had cared about I had already designated in my will. What I took was what was mine in the way that only certain things are yours. My wife's photographs, my books, the small things that carry weight out of proportion to their size. A doorbell camera I had installed the previous October had been recording the footage I needed. I emailed the relevant clips to Jim before I left. On Saturday morning, the new owner's locks were installed. The state sign had been in the yard since closing. I had simply been in the leaseback period, which had now concluded. I had placed a letter under the mat for Brett, typed on plain paper, unadorned. It said, "The house has been sold. The sale closed in January. I have been living here under a leaseback agreement which ended yesterday. I have vacated. You will need to make other arrangements. The details are outlined in the attached documentation from my attorney. I want you to know that I heard you both in the kitchen on a Tuesday in November. I want you to know that I made my own plans. I want you to know that I am well. Dad, I watched from Edith's kitchen window. Edith, who had been my neighbor for 22 years and who had not asked a single question when I explained what I needed, as Brett read the letter once, then again, then a third time. I watched him try the front door. I watched him look at the lockbox. I watched him sit down on the front step with the letter in his hands and stare at the yard. Corinne's car pulled up 15 minutes later. She had been at the grocery store, I found out afterward. She got out with 2 bags and stopped when she saw Brett sitting on the step. I watched her read the letter over his shoulder. I watched her put the grocery bags down very slowly on the sidewalk, as if she needed her hands free for what was coming next. She called my cell phone 4 times. I did not answer. I had already spoken to her in the letter I had mailed 3 days earlier, a longer letter, written by hand, that explained what I had heard, what I had felt, what I had decided, and what I hoped for us going forward. That letter was the honest one. I had spent a week writing it. I told her that I loved her, that I always would, that her mother would have been heartbroken by this, and that I was not closing the door on our relationship, only on the version of it where I did not exist as a full person, with agency and rights, and a life that was mine to direct. As for Brett, I had provided Jim with the footage from the doorbell camera. During the previous fall, Brett had, on 3 separate occasions, used my credit card, which he had access to as an authorized user for household expenses I had agreed to make purchases that were not household expenses. 2 were for golf equipment. 1 was for a weekend hotel stay that I had not been informed about and had not participated in. The total was just under $3,000. Jim had sent a formal demand letter on my behalf. Brett's response came through his own attorney 11 days later. He repaid the full amount plus fees. I do not know what Corinne said to him about it. I did not ask. What I know is this. On a Thursday evening in late April, my daughter knocked on the door of my condo. She was alone. She had a dish covered in foil in her hands. The apple pie, I found out when she held it out to me. She had been crying. She looked, in that moment, like the girl she used to be before the years, and the wrong choices, and a man who saw the world only in terms of what things were worth, had shaped her into someone I sometimes didn't recognize. I held the door open. She came in. We sat at the kitchen table in my new place, with the lake through the window going orange in the late light. And she talked for a long time, and I listened the same way I'd always listened to her. The way you listen to someone you love, even when they have hurt you, with everything you have. We did not fix it that evening. Some things don't get fixed in one evening, but we did not break it further either. And sometimes that is the beginning. Brett is no longer in the picture. Corinne made that choice herself, about 6 weeks after the Saturday morning on the front step. I did not ask her to. I did not suggest it. She told me on the phone one afternoon, matter-of-factly, in the same voice she used to use as a teenager when she had already made up her mind about something and just needed me to know. I said I was sorry it hadn't worked out. I meant it in the way that you mean something is a loss, even when it was also necessary. I live in my condo now. The study is exactly what I wanted. Books, the good chair, afternoon light. I joined a hiking group that meets on Wednesday mornings, which is not something I would have predicted about myself, but the trail clues the head in a way that sitting does not, and the people are decent. Jim and I have lunch every few weeks. Edith comes for dinner on the first Sunday of each month, and we cook together and argue about old movies, which is among the finest ways I know to spend a Sunday evening. My granddaughter visited last month. She is 11. She went immediately to the window in the study and looked at the lake and said, "Grandpa, this place is cool." I showed her my books and she pulled out 3 that she wanted to borrow. I told her she could keep them. There are people who will hear this story and want it to be about revenge. I understand that. There is a satisfaction in the image of Brett sitting on that front step with the letter in his hands. I will not pretend otherwise. But what I want this story to be about is something quieter than revenge. It is about the thing my wife used to say, when things went wrong, you always have more options than you think. It is about the moment I stood in my hallway in my own socks and decided that I was going to be the author of what happened next. I am 67 years old. I get up in the morning and make coffee and sit by the window and watch the light come up over the lake. Nobody whispers plans around me anymore. Nobody measures my garage with their eyes. I made my own plans. And I am just fine.